Thank you very much. Glad to see some familiar faces and a lot of new ones, and a lot, of course, I can't see. I'm going to be talking. Let me start by sharing the screen. I'm going to be talking about how I went back to being a beginning programmer, because when ChatGPT first came out, one of the first things I did with it was to try and pair program with it. And I've really enjoyed that experience very much, but I've also learned quite a few quite significant potential problems. So I'm going to be talking about both those sides of things tonight. I think one of the images that come to mind when you listen to people talking about AI code generation is the idea that people who are using it are suddenly going to take over the whole of the programming world, and very quickly AI will replace even them. And a good model for that, I guess, are the mounted archers who swept down from the Far East, from the Mongol Empire, and ended up at the gates of the West because they were virtually unbeatable at war until the cannon came along. And from that time on, they were on the back foot and virtually disappeared over the coming decades. And I think that's true of AI as it is at the moment. There are huge gains to be got if you use it wisely, but I'm pretty sure that the game is going to change again in ways that we can't foresee at the moment over the next few years. So I'm not one of those who says that AI is going to take over the world right away. And I'm not one of those who say that it's a terrible mistake and we shouldn't have anything to do with it. I've got a fairly centrist position about the use of AI for coding and in general. A little bit about my own background. I'm still coding at the age of 77. I actually write a lot of code, typically about 3 hours, 4 hours a day. And these days, about half of that is written by AI. And the bit that's written by AI is written much faster than I could write it. What I plan to do today is share my experience, give you some pointers as to when I use AI agents, talk a bit about how to use them, and also talk about when not to use them. And that's not going to be a terribly long talk, but once it's over, it'll be your turn to experiment a bit. When we get onto that stage, I'll share some. I'll share a link to a place on the web where you can see fairly detailed instructions for a couple of experiments. And after everyone's had a chance to play around a bit and discuss the results, we'll all group back together again and talk about the results. And at that stage, I'll be happy to answer any questions. So a little bit about my background. As Imo said, I've been involved in BCS, the old BCS OOPS group, and then SPAR for many years. I've been programming for absolutely ages. I, as an 11-year-old, wrote my very first program, and I think I hold the world's longest record for debugging, because the guy that ran the program for it fixed a bug in it, and I didn't discover what the bug was until about 10 years ago. So I've been debugging, which says I'm perhaps not the best programmer, but you can rely on me for tenacity. In my career, I've acted as developer, coach, and instructor, and I've been doing that pretty much full time from 1966 through till about 2008. And I also got involved with neural networks very early. I actually did a simulation of a neural network back in 1974 as part of my MSc thesis, and I've been doing it ever since. And just in case you wonder whether somebody of my age has completely lost my marbles, a few days ago, Simon Wardley and one of his colleagues put up a challenge on LinkedIn in which you had to do about 8 tasks, either coding yourself or in my case, using AI. And I was the first person to finish the challenge. And that's largely because I think pretty well everyone else was hand coding. And I just asked Claude, the AI coding agent, to do most of the work for me. So what am I hoping you'll get out of this? Learn from my mistakes. I've made quite a few, and they're mistakes that you probably want to avoid if you start doing this sort of stuff. And that will give you a chance to make some new mistakes of your own and learn from that, as I've been learning from mine. I mentioned that I started using ChatGPT fairly early on, and one of the first things I did for it, which is a bit meta, but worked out very well, is that I asked ChatGPT to write a Python GUI, graphic user interface, that would access ChatGPT. And the reason I wanted to do that was because I wanted to keep track of all the conversations I had with ChatGPT. And at that stage, it had a fairly limited history. And that went extraordinarily well. I'll talk in a minute about some of the challenges I faced, but they weren't challenges to do with ChatGPT's lack of ability. They were challenges due to the fact that the problem was actually a bit trickier than one might think. That particular bit of software, SpearGPT, I called it, has actually changed radically, because these days ChatGPT does a very good job of keeping track of your conversations with it. But what I discovered I wanted was a tool that would let me use lots of different locally running AI models for conversations and programming tasks and things of that sort. And now SpearGPT is no longer SpearGPT. It should probably change its name. But what it allows me to do is to use about 20 or 30 different models for AI tasks and capture the results for future reference. What's surprising, by the way, is that some of the models, Quen 2.5 is one of them, produce quite usable results when you ask them to code, even though they run quite well on my fairly limited consumer hardware. So things have changed dramatically since the early days. You can now, for simple coding tasks, use models which you can run on your own machine. I said SpearGPT posted a few challenges, and one of the first was that even if I'm writing code for my own use, most of the time I like to have some fairly rigorous automated tests. And one of the things that ChatGPT and I had to do between us was develop a little testing framework that allows the application to run an end-to-end test, not of a web browser, that's quite easy to do, but using the Python GPT. And I ended up with a test which is pretty readable, to me at least, and I'd be fairly happy to put into production. What surprised me was that even in those early days, when I told ChatGPT about the Python package I was using, a package called GUI0, it knew exactly how it worked. It was able to build the GUI, and it was pretty helpful about helping me build the helpers that you need to do automated testing. So that was a very impressive experience. It could do a bit more than that. I actually wrote some use cases because I often do that. I tend to prefer them to stories. And it created an object interaction diagram in plant UML format for the use case which I specified. And I think that's one of the things that people underestimate. Even the earliest version of ChatGPT was very good at transforming one text format, which was good for humans, into a more specific text format, which you could then use with other software to create UML diagrams or flow diagrams or general pictures of concept maps and the like. So the fact that it can output text is much less of a limitation than you might think, because there are a lot of tools that will allow you to take text and turn them into useful diagrams. I started off with ChatGPT. I've used a lot of AI coding agents. Some of them are free, some of them freemium, some of them paid. The two that I've ended up using are principally Claude Code, which is a relative newcomer, and I've just started reusing Cursor. Other things I've tried, Copilot, found in the early days that it wasn't terribly helpful. I do my Python development in PyCharm, and PyCharm now comes with AI, although you have to pay for it, but I haven't found that to be very good. I hear rumors that there's a much better version coming along soon, and I'm looking forward to trying that.
Sorry, which Copilot are you talking about? Is that the
well, originally I started using Microsoft's Copilot in PyCharm.
right?
Because before PyCharm came out with their own, that was really the only possibility.
GitHub Copilot now comes with GPT 4.0.
Sorry, with
GPT 4.0.
Yeah, but unfortunately, it's not the quality of the LLM that matters. It's what the tooling between the LLM and the IDE do. And that's why I stopped using Copilot and why I stopped using PyCharm and why I've recently stopped using Windsurf. Because whatever the back-end LLM, the usable AI coding agents all do a lot of extra stuff. And the extra stuff that Windsurf did started getting so irritating and so prone to create havoc that a few days ago I stopped using it. I'd been paying quite a lot of money to use it because in the past it's been quite good, but it's actually got worse, at least for my use purposes.
Have you used GitLab Duo at all?
Used GitLab?
Duo?
No. Part of the trouble is that although I do try to experiment a lot, I've currently got a typical feed of about 10 AI papers I need to read each day. And I've got a lot of code that I'm trying to write so that my experimentation time is fairly limited. I tend to try something new only when what I've been using gets worse, or somebody I know well tells me, Romilly, you should really try this. It's very good. And at the moment, it looks as if Claude Code and Cursor are good enough for the stuff that I'm doing. Couple of open source packages which you can run locally that are surprisingly good at code generation. Qwen 2.5 Coda and Microsoft's 5.4. I've had very good results with those indeed. Not as good as the top of the range paid things, but good enough that if you just want to experiment a bit, it's a very cheap way of doing it. So what have I built? I mentioned Sphere GPT earlier, but recently I've built quite a few other tools. I'll talk a bit about them now. And as I do so, I'll mention some of the problems that I hit some of them of my making, some of them of the tool's making. You can see that that visual is color coded. The green things that I'm going to talk about are all open sourced, or are more complex code which I haven't yet open sourced, but where the stories ended well. Fourth for the Pico is a story which I'll talk about briefly, where I made a terrible mistake, broke my own rules, and ended up looking an absolute idiot. I mentioned the Wardley challenge. You can see the code for that, but there again, I broke my own rules, although that ended up quite well. And then last of all, there's a project I've been working on recently called Sonnet. I'll tell you a bit more about that. And that was the project where I abandoned using Windsurf and went back to coding by hand. And I'll explain why that was. So brief run through of these. I use mind maps a lot. I've used them since the 1970s. I use an open source version of mind mapping tool called FreePlane. And I have huge numbers of PDFs which I need to read and summarize. So one of the tools I built recently was something which will read a PDF file and turn it into a mind map, a summary of the PDF that's processed. I started off using a process that was largely manual, but it had a couple of bits of AI in it. And actually, that's going to be the basis of one of the exercises that you'll tackle later on. These days, I've pretty well automated the thing end to end. And one of the reasons I've done that is that there is a specific tool, not a coding tool, but an OCR tool created by Mistral, which does a quite incredible job of turning PDFs into markdown documents. And the incredible thing about it is that not only does it do the text, but it also converts images and tables and LaTeX formulae into markdown, so that you have a complete, accurate, but searchable and editable document. And then to make that even more useful, I can take that and turn it into a mind map. And I've found that very, very valuable. There's a link to that code, which is open source, in the resource list, which you'll get at the end of the session. Another thing which I built, because there's been a lot of discussion about code quality and code quality in projects on GitHub, built a thing called Flowmatic. And what Flowmatic does, surprisingly well, is you give it a bit of Python source code, typically of one or more functions and classes, and it will create flowcharts for the Python code. And you'll see an example of that later on, I think. Another project which I haven't open sourced yet, because it's not quite complete, is something which I built because of my interest in the work of a chap called Tom Gilb. Some of you will have heard of Tom. He's been talking about how to develop software better since the 1960s, when he used to work.
Talking about it to this group quite a few times.
Okay. So Tom's a friend. I've known him for ages. One of my favorite books of his is Competitive Engineering. And Competitive Engineering has as its appendix a glossary of most of the terms he uses in his language. But what I wanted was a website which would show me a single definition, but have links to all the related definitions. And so I've written some code which reads the PDF and turns it into a linked website in that format. Tom's very supportive of that. I'll probably be able to make that publicly available in the next few weeks. And if there's a lot of interest in Tom's work, then Imo, maybe I can send you a link and you could share it with the members.
Yeah, we can put all your slides on the past presentation.
Yeah, there isn't a link to this yet because it's not yet open source. I need to do a bit more tidying up. And also, incidentally, I'm doing a parallel job for the full CE glossary, which is the full glossary for language, which has got about 900 terms in it. So I'll let you know when that's done, and if it's appropriate to share it with people, then please feel free to do that. Another project which isn't yet open source is a course platform, and I've been working on this. Well, in one sense, I've been working on it since the late 1960s, when I had a chance to play with a very early computer-assisted instruction program that IBM wrote called CourseWriter 2. And ever since I saw that, I thought there was a lot of potential in using computers to train. But for the last 10 years or so, I've been desperately looking for a course platform that was easy to use, easy to create courses, which took advantage of all the things we've learned about how people learn and remember over the last 20 years, and almost none of them do. But these days, of course, there's an extra ingredient in that you can use AI both to help develop courseware and to help students and to help improve courses once you have experience of what they find difficult. That's a long-term project, but so far, AI has done a superb job of helping me build that iteratively with automated tests. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to open source at least a basic version of that within the next few months. Another tool is something called Transcriber, a very simple idea, but it's something which I use many times a day. And the idea is quite simple. I tend to forget things a lot. We all do a bit, but at my age, you do a lot. And so I need an easy way of making notes, which I can pick up later and ideally put into my second brain, which is an application called Logseek. It's similar to a number of other second brain type tools on the market. But Logseek is the one that I tend to use. What Transcriber does is it looks in one of the subdirectories of my Dropbox folder. And whenever I dictate a note on my phone, I use an application which, as soon as I've finished making that audio note, sends it to the Dropbox folder. And at that point, Transcriber notices there's a new file, and it uses some open source AI software to turn it into text. And then it puts the text in suitable form into my Logseek directory so that the notes will show up when next I take a look at Logseek. I think I've spent on and off perhaps 2 hours on that, probably less. All of the code been written by AI, and apart from one minor inconvenience, when I wasn't recording very well, and so the text was a bit hard to hear, and Transcriber I hadn't correctly configured so that it guessed the language and it kept on guessing Welsh. However, today I discovered that I can actually say what language it's going to use. It's now using English. It hasn't made a mistake so far. And just to give you a hint, pretty well all of the exercise information that you've got today were dictated by me to Transcriber and then subject to very minor edits to get them into the format that you'll finally see. Another project, Olama Oracle, nothing to do with the database Oracle, I'll talk, I think I've got a couple of visuals of that in a minute. But yeah, that's a fairly wide range of tools. That's by no means all the ones I've built, but a fairly wide range of tools where the tool's fairly simple, but it's useful, and AI has written pretty well all of the code. So let's move on to the disasters. I do a lot of work with Raspberry Pi Picos, little very inexpensive microprocessors built by the Raspberry Pi team. And most of the time people program them in MicroPython, which is fast to code in, but a bit slow to run, or C++, which for me at least is very slow to code in, but very fast to run. And there's a language called Forth, which keeps on poking its head up every few years, which seems to have the best of both worlds, except it looks really weird and it's quite hard to get your head around. But once you've got your head around the way that it works, it runs about as fast as C or C++, but it's got a REPL, a read event print loop, which makes it as easy to program interactively as MicroPython. And I thought to myself, it's ages since, in fact, the last time I did a Forth port was for the Sinclair ZX Spectrum when it had just come out. So that's a bit of a while ago. I thought, I'll do a port to the Pico. And then I thought, well, why don't I look first and see if there's something already there? And it turns out that there's a really excellent implementation. But I also made the mistake of announcing the fact that I'd got AI to write a decent Forth for the Pico. And it turned out that the very simple stuff was great and everything that relied on it was absolutely useless. And the mistake I made was I let AI write the tests to sort of the code, and I didn't look carefully at the tests. So the tests all passed because it had completely misunderstood what was needed. The Wardley challenge I mentioned earlier, the embarrassment there is that I didn't do automated tests for the code that it generated, because I could look at the end result and I could see that the job it was doing was fine. And emboldened by that, I did another Forth related project called Fonny, which is an attempt to build an IDE for when I'm developing Forth on the Pico. And Fonny turns out to be quite a challenge, and I'll explain some of the issues of that a bit later on. But to preempt that story, I let AI write a lot of code and a lot of tests, and the result was disastrous because the complexity of what sounds like a very simple application turned out to be much more than Windsurf could handle. So, summarizing what I've learned before I take a bit of a look in more detail at a couple of extra things. AI has turned out to be really useful for personal projects, tools, proofs of concept. And if you're trying to build even a medium-sized app, because the course platform is not trivial, it does pretty well at that. But that's partly because I'm using Django, and the AIs have been trained a lot on Django code, and also because the application breaks down very nicely into simple stories which need to be done one at a time and which don't interact with each other much. So if you've got an app like that, you can get amazingly good results very quickly. And if it's browser-based, as the course platform is, then of course you can get automated tests using Selenium or one of the alternatives. I've talked about AI for code generation, but one of my tips is that you don't need to restrict yourself to that. Some of the current tools are really good at producing project plans. As we've seen, they can be very good at producing code. They are extremely good at creating documentation. And while I always fine tune the output, I now always start off producing READMEs for a project using AI once I've got a reasonable amount of code. And they'll do that extremely well and very reliably. Another tip, do not make the mistake I made of getting overconfident in the quality of the output. You need to check all the code that it creates, and you need to check all the tests that it writes. And also a problem with both Windsurf and Cursor, and probably with other AIs as well, you can set them up so that they decide what they need to change in the way of code, and they typically will make more than one change at a time. It's very hard to stop them doing that. And if they've got something wrong, they can really do damage to your code base very quickly before you've had a chance to spot it. And so for that reason, I've got into the habit of committing code as often as I can to Git, so that if something goes wrong, I can just revert and then try another approach. Use one of the catchphrases of today. You want to shift security left. In other words, if your application needs to be secure, think about it early on and don't rely on AI to generate secure code or to test security. Get a professional to look at it if that merits it. If not, use one of the good open source security probing tools. And the reason I say that is that I had to throw away the first version of the course platform code. I'd done 2 weeks before I realized that the technique which it was using to maintain sessions was intrinsically insecure and was a known major hole in Django applications. So I had to throw away 2 weeks work and give it a stiff wigging about how to do the security.
Thanks. This is a great time to interrupt and ask. I've counted 17 people, I think, in the room. Is there anybody who doesn't like pizza? We're going to order some vegetarian, some vegan, and some meat. So I'll just get on with that.
Very good. I mentioned it was important to check both code and tests. This isn't a literal example, but it's pretty close to what AI did for one of the bits of code I was writing. I asked it to define a very simple function. In the example I've chosen, it's an add. It was actually a bit more complicated than that, but similar in principle. And I asked it to write the test, and it came up with some fairly decent tests. And I looked at the tests and thought, okay, if it passes those tests, the code is okay. And then I came back and looked at the code and discovered that what it had done was special case the code for each one of the tests. So it wasn't actually doing anything useful at all. But the tests passed and the test looked okay. So you need to check both, and you need to check them very thoroughly, because otherwise it may do very useless things. Okay, I've done enough talking. What I suggest is that if anyone's got questions they'd like to ask now, ask away. If you are in the BCS room, form a team with your neighbours. You will need, to get the most out of the exercises, you will need a laptop, which I guess one of you should drive. And my recommendation is that you pick a laptop that's already got an account with either ChatGPT or with Anthropic's Cursor. But if you haven't got that, then the exercise information, the experiment information, will tell you how to set up an account, and that will be good enough for the experiments we're going to do. I'm hoping that if you have got laptops handy, or phones at a pinch, you should be able either to type in that short link or use that QR code to take you to the page that's got the experiment details on. But before we start doing that, any questions about what we've covered so far?
Can I ask a question, Ian?
Yeah,
While
please.
online, would you
Yeah.
agree, Romilly, that when you check generated test code and generated production code, you can have a different mindset for each, and that adds helps to add a safety net and stops you getting stuck in accepting sensible looking test code and sensible looking production code that actually isn't really testing the functionality and the same quality that you would do if you were doing TDD yourself. Is that something you think about? Different mindset for each one?
Yes, I think that's important. Part of the mindset is that I try to imagine that I've been landed with a really troublesome pair, and that I'm working with somebody who appears to be quite bright, very inexperienced, knows all the buzzwords, but isn't actually terribly good at coding yet. And that affects both the way that I phrase the prompts. I've learned to be more and more precise and more opinionated in the way that I phrase the prompts to the AI. And when I look at the tests, I've worked with some really good professional testers, and I try to look at the tests with their eyes in the way that they used to look at my tests and say, Romilly, have you thought of ...
Yeah.
Yes, I think a different mindset is great. And I think in each case, this is one of the points that a lot of people have made. This stuff works really well if you've got solid experience. You put this in the hand of novices and you're going to regret it, because all it will do is amplify their mess and their mistakes.
Thanks.
Could I ask about your background? It sounds as if you're quite keen on doing a good job on testing.
Well, I like TDD.
Uh-huh.
But pre-AI assistance, I would use TDD and found the AI generation of tests quite frustrating at first. And I've gradually evolved ways to try to work with AI
Uh-huh.
in a way that scales and that I can maintain the kinds of quality that I would get from TDD. But that was one finding, was that having that different mindset, and because the tests and code that are generated can look really plausible if I use the same mindset to evaluate both. But I found it success when like you said, I'm really thinking about testing when I look at the test code. I'm really thinking about the coverage. I'm not thinking about the quality of whether the code works or not. It'd be easy to fall into that trap. You look at the tests and think, well, that should work. But you have to actually think about the coverage.
Yes.
And the thing, have you got the good functional testing that you would, yeah. So that's where I am so far. But I don't get as much time, I think, as you've had. So I really value your what you're sharing. It's great.
In which case I'll share a couple more things. Coverage is vital. And so I regularly do coverage tests with AI generated code much more often than I do when I'm writing, because if I'm writing the tests, I do by the book TDD, and I'm therefore pretty well certain that every line of code that I write has got a test that verifies it.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think is really important with AI is to do some mutation testing. I don't know if you're familiar with that technique, but basically a mutation test goes on your code base and checks that if it changes the code, the tests break. Because if it doesn't, it's a sign that there's a problem. There's not sufficient testing. And that's worked pretty well. But I'll also give you, I said I was going to talk a bit more about funny, and I haven't in this because I've written an article on LeanHub, on LinkedIn, which talks about the experience in some detail. I'll give you a very quick summary now. Funny, it doesn't matter what the application does. The key thing about Funny is that it's an application that has 3 threads running. One is a GUI, one is the application itself, the core business logic, as it were, and the third is a thread that manages an asynchronous serial communication with a Raspberry Pi Pico. Whenever I write multi-threaded code, my heart sinks and I try my best to find a way not to do that. But in this case, there was no alternative that I could see. Windsurf never got the end-to-end test to run. And that was due to a mixture of it constantly misinterpreting the evidence as to what was going wrong, and being confused by the fact that initially I decided to use SQLite as the database, and that's notoriously troublesome when it comes to multi-threaded applications. And in the end, I replaced SQLite with Arculite, which is SQLite based but multi-thread safe. And I used a technique I learned years ago, which has a neat little function called wait until. And you give wait until the name of a function that ought to be true but might not be true immediately. And wait until just keeps on trying until either it passes, in which case the test passes, or it times out, in which case the test fails. What Windsurf had done had been to try and cope with the uncertainties of multi-threading by littering the code with sleeps. And that's always a code smell. The end result of its test was that it had the tests took 33 seconds to run and still quite often failed. And after 5 hours work, most of which was spent removing the hard-coded references to SQLite, which it put in, all the tests now pass reliably and they run in 1.1 second. So I'm glad to say I can still do a better job than AI can. But yeah, I mean, you've got to take, you need an experienced tester's mindset to deal with anything that's at all out of the run-of-the-mill. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. What platform do you use for your multi-threaded applications? Which of the applications you spoke about so far are multi-threaded?
I'm running Linux on an Intel box most of the time. Quite a lot of the applications I also run on high-end Raspberry Pis. And I do all my programming in a Linux environment or a Raspbian environment, and I do all my coding, almost all my coding, in Python. Does that?
Yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it must be much more difficult to test AI applications which are multi-threaded than single-threaded applications.
These are not applications that use AI, most of them. A couple do. But actually, that's not particularly hard because when I'm using AI inside Sphere GPT or one of the other applications, I'm doing it synchronously. So there's no additional thread there. I mean, there is, but it's running on their hardware, not mine.
How long do you want to take over the experiment? It's now 7:15.
Okay. So are those links working as they should?
Well, I've got onto rareschool.com.
And there should be a page that says experiments.
Our experiments, yep.
And that tells you what you should do.
It tells how long we've got to do it.
Well, if you read the notes, I'll give you a 1-minute synopsis. There are 2 experiments. The second one has 3 parts. You don't need to do them all. They're simply enough that you should be able to get the first one done pretty quickly. But if you don't finish them, then take them home and play at home if you want to. But each of them is based on a very cut down version of one of the applications I've been talking about. And I'm suggesting that if you're in the spa room, you work in teams. If you're working at home, obviously you won't be able to do that. Have a play, and then at a time of Imo's choosing, let's reconvene and have a discussion of the results. And in order to make that, sorry?
Well, the pizza's arriving at 8, so
Okay.
we want.
Oh, that's brilliant. So my only other tip is leave yourselves 5 minutes before the pizzas arrive to do a quick retrospective in the team, looking at what worked, what didn't work, and surprises and questions. And then as and when we want, we can discuss those in a plenary session.
ChatGPT.
All right. So I'm going to set up some breakout rooms now.
Okay. I'm going to hop downstairs and get a glass of wine. So when I come back, my slurs will be word, but I should still be able to help you with any questions if you've got any. See you in a few minutes.
Now. Okay. Does anybody want to join us over here?
Last week. Yes, I don't really know what to do. So you're the one. Yeah, that's it. Actually, no.
I don't, so I'd be right back to creation.
Yeah. I'll just sit at the.
Being able to see the instructions.
Yeah,
Well, they're looking for 5 minutes. You can hardly find a PDF.
Yeah.
It tells you how to choose a part from the library.
You could shoulder surf, you just shoulder surf over there.
Generational AI to write tests, but that part of the process. So here's a suitable function.
I haven't done that. We've done it magic, so we're in ChatGPT.
Okay, so we can.
And then it says, yeah, okay, experiments.
No, but I think it's something that we should try to set up in due course, that we've got that. So.
Imagine you're looking for.
I was interested in doing this tomorrow. Wasn't sure we could.
That's what we want to do. It's going to go in here.
Which is here.
I didn't know. It was, we didn't know what it was.
Check for quality. So community. Enough questions.
Building.
Doesn't know how to use.
We're just looking at.
Did you experiment one else to get Gemini to write code to?
How do you do this? Find that PDF. Right.
The experiment.
Oh, okay, fine. Yeah.
What do you do for the day job?
Actually,
We built to size wheel
Yeah, we might do it.
This is a sample. That's the prompt I use.
And tools you might use to
Yeah, right, private sessions.
Conversation designers.
Right, sample.
Takes a little time to start on.
Did you paste in everything on?
No, just that question. Yeah, there. So I think turtles all the way down.
It is turtles all the way. It's intelligence.
That's what I put.
Brings me back.
You know where the quote's from.
Oh, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, of course, yeah. Well, I think along.
Turtles
Just showing you.
Yeah,
Well, no, you.
That's not
From don't you? Yeah, okay, fine.
You get to a certain age.
No, actually, I believe it's got
From the project.
Isn't that in the?
provenance.
Yeah, we'll see.
If you actually dig into it, yeah, discover it.
I thought it was in. It's about the discussion of, you know, flat world is
That's where the
Yeah.
elephants and the turtles.
It's all, yeah, and then what's below the turtle?
Exactly. Very clever young man and very impressive logic. But he's-
Romilly
it's
Cocking,
turtles all the way
yeah.
down. That's the way I've heard the story. Actually, go and look it up.
Okay.
You'll discover there's much more.
Some of those more.
Because this is. Don't take this the wrong way, guys, but you're of a certain age, so am I.
Selling us hands on this.
I was at it's on. I did a weird thing.
Who are you?
So I'm Paul.
You asked the same question twice, I think. Okay.
It says on the.
AI
Yes, I got it. Good boy, good boy.
Yeah. I started a master's in AI in October.
Yeah, there's additional bits.
Background software engineering, but.
Got this GitHub checklist.
Software engineering, architect, behavior.
It's our infrastructure.
Imagine AI.
I went back and did a master's because bachelor's was pretty long.
That was there before though. It's just he had all of it.
Engineering, I can teach me software engineering.
That was all there.
But I didn't really get to play with AI because it doesn't come up in the day job.
There was some more that, yeah, it's just says, yeah, the
Current
metric.
day job, I've got
There's metric.
few models being around me. And the- A lot of the time, especially if you're taking.
Okay, so I think.
Yeah, so that, yeah, so it will link, yeah, so it was that one, yeah, right, yeah, so, yeah. Good, those heads up.
Good data scientists or models.
Exactly.
Stats.
So you have to wrap them in ML to actually productionize and just even basic shit fast.
Yeah.
It's produced. This just seems to be
Training.
isn't it, as well?
Split test them.
Yes.
And do the evaluation, they're still
Do
drifted, whether
And,
it's.
and do you do A/B testing in the live so that you can see,
Yeah.
you know, all that sort of stuff, engineering.
API calls.
So I figured it was worthwhile doing an AI master's.
I think the.
To engineering. I can then critique what the hell they're doing at the present time. I figure I've got one more job in.
I feel much the same.
Yeah. But what was funny was we had a lecture on Monday.
It's the feedback.
It's basically about the thesis structure and stuff like that.
What are you doing it?
Oh, brilliant.
Pop out on your buffer.
It's funny enough where I am.
You can only prompt.
If I just open.
New question.
When actually the degree was pretty good, they bought it really
Very
badly.
Yeah.
A lot of the AI, it's a
Most of them.
it's hard from what I can see. Because it's things like I come across graduates. They can't tell me what's happening.
No. And actually, it would be very useful if they knew.
That's what you mean.
Well, that's right.
Relational database, but.
Well, yeah, but same thing, I mean, like.
It's 10 years since I.
After it.
Can't even count, it's 12.
Actually, I think we met at one of
I
these,
think we did, yeah.
about 6 months ago.
Yeah, I think something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
But, you know,
We're not actually on
still got my copies of Dragon Book.
yeah.
This is why I was looking for AI. Zoom V7.
There are things that,
My Mac I've got an Intel processor, so it's
and
have that installed.
I just checked and I'm
Getting a bit lost here.
This is hundred each other maybe 30 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to do, but I'm not sure which package we're looking for.
Because I think it would be very, I know you don't, he gets
Oops.
he gets applications when you talk serious object stuff.
One of the interesting things, if he's doing forms, but he'll do Lisp. You know, like I was going to stack.
I forced them this.
I remember doing brackets.
But
We're trying to work out whether, for example.
Python has this same property. Python has the same property as small talk. Hey, it's very object, it's not much object oriented. Think about it with small talk.
I think
People
generating
we need that is extremely complex. And was always the thing.
there's
Way back in the day. That's getting into AI.
if you want to
Python will be, Skynet will be written in Python.
And
It seems likely, and I actually think that one of the reasons is language models.
Well, that's what it is.
This whole sort of thing of using language models and AI, I think is going to stagnate the characters because.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
baked into the-
your problem
there's
is
enough code out there.
that you're something. Well,
that.
you get that problem that it can only do things that it's been trained on because it's the best phrase I've seen around is stochastic parrot.
Oh, yes, that was Taleb's attempt to dismiss it.
I don't think it was Taleb's, but just sort of. But
I like him. I just think
Yeah.
he's wrong on some things.
No, but the idea is that. but the fact that what you've actually got is a probabilistic matrix. Therefore, the code generated is non-deterministic, and it's a probability table at the end of the day. Therefore, there is no reasoning model. It is from. So, I'll slap a reasoning model on the back of a stochastic process sounds to me like
Human. Yeah, very human.
Don't go up against.
How the hell
him
do
on
you
this.
think you do it?
Yeah.
well, I have a model of reality, and then I loop around. There is a little bit of hallucination, but this again, the one that I did like.
Sorry, prompt example.
LLMs considered bullshit. They're not hallucinating. They're constantly a bullshit generator. It cannot distinguish between it generating correctness or wrong.
That was that
I hope there's some discussion of this later because we and a colleague have been using Cursor. The colleagues using JavaScript. We're generating.
Yeah, get this. So that is it. So it is that file.
We're doing different things.
Download it.
You're broader than just coding. And I find it intriguing to
So how do
how do we tell
import?
certain and still giving some value.
It generates a script.
I perceive patterns which I think I'm getting slightly better at utilizing.
What in terms of the behavioural output?
Upload files of
In terms of how the tool behaves.
Oh, okay.
And Philip has been ChatGPT doing it longer than I have. So I've been learning some of the tricks that he's already.
I know them.
But I may or may not have gone down the same cul-de-sacs.
There's define search, numerical analysis, language. Okay.
Some, but I've listened to what you've said about this cul-de-sacs and tried to avoid them.
Because what I was starting to, well, again,
Looks like you can.
Okay.
job's a bit too intensive to do too much side work, although I've got some side projects I would like to attempt with it. And you were being very cautious about allowing any input next to it because of things like releasing all your IP to the internet inadvertently.
Except with the recommendations. That works.
So what I was wondering, play with, because generally I build a business application, cloud stuff.
Well, this just run the generated code directly.
But I've always for all because again.
So what we should do really is
Fundamentally,
20 lines. And when you write that to zero trust, then it understands that service. Modularized.
Yes, that's
So if you lift most of the boilerplate down into a framework, you can reduce your marginal development to take one of these classes, very much other classes with small amounts of code. I was trying to work out is whether or not I can use sort of agentic type AI. Effectively have a different prompt, effectively templating on steroids where it's crossed. Because from what I can see, it's not good at doing context. Therefore, what I want to do is have it generate the one file about.
Interesting. Come up with the same thing, but suitable.
It's probably pretty good at generating the boilerplate.
Right.
Because it sees that an awful lot.
Well, that will.
In the code base is trained on.
You copy the code out.
You won't see this boilerplate. That's why I thought you have to contextualize it with the sample project. It says this is your model.
That's it then. So it'll bring the YAML in.
Now to
What it is in mine. Where you from?
because again,
That was the problem.
it's always been the case.
Save this or something.
Business space tonight. The other one I want to
I
have.
don't know, is it doing any calls?
Yeah,
Basically, there's an API out to that.
Yeah, for the YAML.
That's an open source thing anyway, isn't it?
Terraform, 3 or 4 years.
Getting lots of
Building up modular Terraform.
We had was
Everything.
PDF document that says this is how you go about searching for a package.
Thinking about Terraform, by the way, so.
We asked
It's declarative,
to implement
declarative cloud assembly language.
in Python.
Basically provides a similar across different cloud providers, APIs for provisioning. But the problem combined is it it's again the problem of your junior developers.
Where we are then.
Nothing about actually exists. So they stand it up and then the boss says it's going live in 2 weeks. Standard.
yeah, they don't
Fan.
do anything. Well, they do, they really they're using that.
I teach people
I know I was here, but
architecture.
Is it?
Yeah.
So rather than do that, I started wrapping, taking.
Okay, start.
It's not too easy.
Which tells you how many you can go.
Making opinionated methods, which are because again, you can write about Terraform and you got.
You know these things are out there.
Oh, yes.
Instead, what I've done, optimized it.
What's your input? What's your output?
Down again.
For some reason. Oh, it's added together the issues in the pull request.
You can drag and drop an API.
So this shows it's very active.
Then you plug in behind there.
Talk to me as well, don't you? Was it R?
Like, that's all I want this to be zone.
SQL in
So,
database.
you know what I mean? So that with some of this stuff leads itself into a lot of post.
Saying you want to create a free plane mind now.
From a pattern perspective.
Ah, yes, using something called free
From an
plane.
infrastructure perspective. Most applications are the same thing.
This is what this particular piece of code.
Tried to take a little bit of the scenarios we talked about. So how does one create an API? So for
Yeah, to create.
That's a load of rubbish.
Just a bare bones.
That's the bit that actually does it.
Yeah. So it's spending some time on. Here's the bit that.
I've got sleep 1,000 of it, make it run crap.
But I was intrigued. I didn't say anything about which.
Your implementation.
Yeah, that's right.
It's done on Pick Flask.
And it's picked Python, which is kind of obvious. Picked Flask, which was a slight surprise. Because I have
Actually,
It's so widely used, isn't it?
it is.
but the problem with it is like
Like a song, is when they track with sleep, don't they?
when I looked at it a few years back.
It's changed a lot. It's very, very powerful. Really.
You used to have a major problem.
You've obviously copied it because
It's single threaded. It's fast API.
it's just a second.
No, I'm not sure. I think I've read that.
Something like this, I suppose, if you.
Unicorn interfaces to your web
Show me the
server.
bits of code
that
that
resolves that. So that take away the problem from that.
Nobody's trying to do it at the moment, though.
Sure. Last couple of months, but not completely swear by it.
Books and things, isn't it? There's loads of,
You know,
no, artists and
is this the kind of thing that you were talking?
stuff in there.
Yeah, there was. Would this be recognisable to you? And you know, it looks. It's more than your 20 lines than 600 lines.
Yeah.
But is that?
Ask anything.
Well, if you go back, there's an obvious, go back to the REST API. I mean, this goes down to native versions on REST APIs.
You want to do it? I can do a supplement.
No, just stop there. I just want to look at the, yeah, thank you.
McCartney's is one of the music guys, and so I've seen him. He's anti-AI and
Yeah, maybe it's just me. Okay, so that's the status.
We have a team of 6 people.
Again, that goes back to the idea of,
Yeah.
it's not very restful.
I can give a either extension. I know
In the technological or the.
No, well, the philosophical thing.
If it is a YAML.
Resources and that, it's basically on.
decent
I've
team.
seen that, I see people doing that a lot.
What if your team is, you know, one senior?
So how would you refine this? So there's the.
I don't know.
it's a simplified schema.
I suppose I'm being petty in that what I would expect to do is if you scroll down that little bit, then the way that I would do that, if I was trying to actually be able to clean about it, is I would start it all /file.
So ask it to be clean and properly restful and see what it comes up with.
Yeah, and then.
Any other criticisms of it?
No. Again, I don't really write that much Python, so I'm not.
The trouble is, it's at the bottom.
Again, that thing where I see people doing this a lot. Again, that's why most of the sample work comes out like this. If you're doing REST, it should be file ID/status, file/ID/transcription. Because it's that's what I mean about it being resource centric.
Right.
Yeah, for not spotting that it's doing something silly later
Later
on. Yeah.
It's really hard.
What's the other part you said?
Clean, I think is another.
Yeah.
It's another sort of criticism. It's hard to.
So you don't, I think the difference between our styles is I was trying to be pedantic and very
Knew
clear
what you were
about
supposed
what
to
I
be.
mean, whereas you tend.
And you'd use your calculator anyway.
To see what happens.
I'm quite engaged with
Changing the logic, doesn't it?
Well, it's that thing I talk about often, which is when the cost of something goes down, so much changes around. You know, you use more of it. Use it in places, and the complements change. But I look at this and say, well, if the cost of generating code drops,
You're absolutely.
so fast, the whole process around itself will hell. Predicated on sort of, it's really hard to do and pin down all the various details and get everything, you know, to work well. So we're going to look at it code. It's really important to try, struggle hard to get it as good as we can the first time.
Yep.
Yeah. And then this thing comes along and chucks out that lines of code to build something. You test it and you think, okay, how am I going to test this? So, well, let's try running. So this is,
Yes.
and it comes up and says, error, I'll just fix that error.
That same choosing a Python library document, isn't it? But this time it's
It's all sort of an evolutionary process you can to actually get the results.
This is what I.
So
And that's what I was trying to get at about rather than trying to get it to boil the ocean, building the whole thing in one fell swoop.
And I've just gone through this, I accidentally.
Do anything?
Well,
Okay, there we go.
No, it's done pretty much.
Yeah, well, that's a much better.
The question is.
So that goes back.
Find implementation, last with.
Documents.
SQL line, love SQL
Yeah,
line.
yeah, yeah. Well, again, out of the box. So, but this goes back to again what samples there, and going back to this whole thing about.
You in? Yeah.
I've had so many problems.
Yeah, it's.
Solution
I think
space
there's,
or-
no, there are generations of libraries, external
why we built
libraries for Python code.
So you got
Really show their
physical
age.
code.
And there's an enormous code base on virtual environments.
Yeah, yeah, VMs, yeah.
No, not VMs.
Everything, the whole
They're
financial world.
environments where the scope of so you don't.
20 years ago, I was
your runtime machine. There's a
Yes.
whole lot
Also
of
runs
libraries that you're not using.
Yes.
So it,
You can have 50-year-old
of innovations
still
in
run
that, with one from a couple.
Obviously, the people that wrote it, you haven't got all the comment, as you were saying, that's
One solution to rule them all.
So what
And I've been struggling to
system,
try and get
reverse engineer.
Russia, as Romilly referred to, use that.
It's Java.
Training, retraining that is all.
You'd always refactor your code. What it's doing.
Stop it.
So for you,
Then because.
as long as you've got somebody that you have to still.
No, so here's the rule,
make
follow the rule. Then someone. Do this, consult the rules.
Yes.
And
It's the
realized, like this morning.
type.
At all.
Topic.
And I also then
Put that.
got into.
I missed
talking
those
about
days.
the fact whether I-
Everybody thinks it's not, but it's all still there.
And I said,
Payment anywhere in the world.
I'd got a working.
Processed on an
It created for me.
In when you book a flight,
Which I really
flight
like.
anywhere in the world.
Bit of authentication.
Yeah,
It mangles things. It was.
Because, you know, we've always
Sorry,
been
I don't think I
backwards.
said this to you.
We bring out
It
new.
was like I passed the point where AI and
Every
other personality came in with its own.
You know, trillions.
So it started to drop,
Still.
software code.
Then we've got a bit of software called Kicks.
Generated other code.
Is the transaction
dropped out.
application
So
processor.
part of my computer.
So that sits in between your database.
Basically saying, I want this done in
IMS and things, and there's more key transactions.
Build on, but it always wanted to go.
Just,
And I don't know why.
So,
yeah.
yeah, so you can talk about the modes of.
Everybody knows, because we're just business to business.
Say, you know.
So if you're not doing that, we don't
Which start saying,
everybody
architect.
in my next name.
And it's very good, was my, I'm gonna test something.
It's like,
Okay.
well, it's just, it's, you know.
How do you stop it?
And you preserve it
Change
from
the
some.
fix. And then there'll be a time inevitably where you realise you've got to modify that. Because it just.
Because again, you see, I'm coming to this from the perspective of.
Don't ask him to write code.
Large scale.
It's a very young.
Now, one of the reasons why I tend to talk this stuff
Use the scheme. You were to
the
say.
basic thing you're trying to do.
I don't think we do. We don't need to know the schema because we use the schema to generate the
This API across 75 entities. That's your starter for 10 before you can actually really start doing the business stuff, even all this stuff, you need a database model. And importantly, that one has to be rock solid because now you can actually start having to engage with the business. They realise they can't.
There's some quite interesting stuff. Go to the cursor documents. You know, the one with the rules.
I saw this a little bit with he was getting to write grant proposals. But again, it was the buzzword bingo, you know. So he put stop in everything. You can vocab to say, never use the whole words or phrases in your. So it changed it to explain more in his voice.
That's interesting.
As much as possible.
So this
We've had a client
code that
Generate a.
take that
100%.
If you don't.
Overuse ChatGPT. We've just been.
Most of the times if there's the code not functionality.
And I think it is part of that.
Yes.
And something more, but it's also.
Field or
The facility with which grants intend. Different.
Really? What, you can get them easier over
I
there?
think so.
Oh, there's a lot more bodies of funding bodies.
And there's a lot more money.
Yeah.
And they didn't have any of
The tenure track, but there's no differentiation, all that kind of thing.
Is that? Yeah, yeah.
And
I should have the mic.
I don't know. I have a feeling.
They said, oh, we'll put that, you know, they work with.
For some new.
You see, one of the bits that I was confused about them, again, well, should be
The Apple guy before. Those things. You know,
version of.
This is music. That's a direct. I don't think it's actually.
It's like, I'm sure there's a bit of a.
No,
You have these rules. So rules.
You just said, you know, there is.
Right.
Fantastic.
You can use your conversation with person. Try to modify its behaviour.
Yeah.
Do things like, you know, conform.
Well, yeah. Well, that's the thing when if they get banged.
Precise Django example.
Now they've got loads of money.
This one came up with a short from Taiwan. That's to say about why it came up. But, as you can see, these can become quite elaborate. And they become that.
You see how much strain.
construction, physical.
Yes.
There's a great, there's a great YouTube video of a guy screen scripts this site.
Okay.
It is all top generating.
Right.
So it's really excellent.
I mean, you're an expert in Django. So of course, you've got to test it. It won't just be an example.
Yeah, exactly.
You are. This is one of the.
You're a failing student.
I don't know. Yeah, exactly. You're an idiot. Stochastic parrot monkey. But you know.
And it can work.
Year and a half ago, sort of discovering things about how do you, it's the idea that if you were,
That's what the subs do anyway.
Yeah.
it's really important to get this right because I want to go to do a better job for you. Really good. Do a better job for you. It's like, and of course, it's become law.
Yeah.
You are an expert in Python. I really like you. It's Monday morning and we got a fresh mind.
Well,
and we're going to do a really good job.
Did you see the one about DeepSeek?
Are you already like working on?
If you ask it to explain Tiananmen Square,
Oh, yeah,
it won't do that. No. If you say explain Tiananmen Square and misspell all the words, it will do so quite adequately and break.
Oh, it rules, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a funny session here a few months ago about denial of service using and the speaker kept all the examples he had. He was being extraordinary. I've done that.
5 minute warning, everyone.
Somebody in the audience said,
Learned off 4chan. Those to tell you.
his answer was fantastic. He said, "He's going to be my boss in 3 years."
Actually, the author, British author, science fiction writer.
Taking over the whole
AGI around.
Trustee.
So you get it's a little bit hitchhiker.
They use HSBC.
Which toilet about user reading well last night. I said, I know, I saw it all, you know. He's a little bit light on magnesium though, you know. So it's all about the idea. It's a bit like go back to Victorian Edward. There's all the servants talking about it, but it's the domestic appliances, you know.
Come back to the I needed.
Oh, it's had a.
I got very lucky in that I had a couple of mates there that years ahead of me.
Using AI.
Unusual in itself.
Yeah, well,
Try to explain the more precise. Precise
I
way.
used to have tapes on. I made my
The less.
covers.
Yeah, that's what I used to use.
Away from pushing it.
Don't think I think first. Because somebody else has done it.
The CDs.
It's overusing.
Oh yeah. That much of an opinion about it that I.
Yeah.
I knew that all.
And then sometimes it come up with a warning, like, you know, it was still the vogue on constructive fleet. I do that. So,
Yeah. It's like a human. You use it.
yeah.
What do you call it? By about 10%. I have. Many.
One out.
Oh yeah.
So AI is now I use it.
The social engineering.
Yeah.
After it looked into this.
I
Read by Adam himself.
found one in school.
Or I would just use it.
Scottish Education Department, it's a great books.
Overflow.
And it had
Now
2K of 6502 assembler.
Just the searching
my
Google and it's like overflow.
behavior on your tangerine microsound 60.
Sometimes fills the gaps.
It's
6502 and.
Origination.
which initially I was thinking, oh yeah, I had that. But I much preferred 6002.
Very important these other processes start coming.
Motorola assemblers, you're trying to processors were much
They were trying to riskier when you use newer technologies
dialogue chips
for which there are
Picked out the remap topics.
to a different base address. Then
Bearing in mind.
going back to power theory. So second year,
information rather than
registered
First time using that.
the hardware called the software called
you can ask it
1988
to write the test for you.
You got bonus ones.
Try it again once it's
So your emulator and get the right.
It will
Say if you want to use chat, sign up.
Yeah.
always best when you run them, that same test to generate them.
Have you I've very often come across
This is Gen AI, generative AI, which
Proxima.
Yeah, yes, I know. Sort of VMware can.
It's like applied. You can build your own rack. And all that stuff. You can deploy your own virtual machines and cloud and all that. It seems because you need to know almost like an operating system to be deployed at speed.
No, I the old fashioned way in that I had a couple of servers
It's
with
very helpful. I completely agree.
Hyper-V on there and put the elements on those.
How have things been while I've been away, Emo?
Docker. And ages ago, I've got to actually revive it because I'm installing sort of a stack of stuff.
amazing that it's
You think that's where it's getting hacked?
This cluster with real hardware.
That's what people from vets, isn't they?
Hanselman ages ago. He'd ordered something. It was quite cheap to build because you know, like, yeah. But the whole thing was you could do another
It's Terraform.
Directly. Terraform's hashing while it's got apply, and then they're trying to change the licensing so somebody can look at that. But it's basically it's a declarative.
Like
Ansible or something.
Yeah, but
spinning up or managing.
spinning up.
You then have to go and phone up a
So
person.
I tend to split it.
Just save a transcript of the whole thing.
Again, you do a certain amount of management. Yeah, I tend to hack distinction between.
It's sort of like,
Substitution fees.
Could you just say in your group, do a quick retrospective, and the pizza's here, so I'll go to the.
Perspective.
Yeah.
I might have just.
Okay, so
But for example, no, if I've templated this, I've got modules to do. Oh, look, great to do to each.
We had that.
They
went mad saying, "Oh no, it was definitely
service and behaviour.
It wasn't.
Was the sweet spot or
sweet searching."
trying to build. But this one, right? Ecosystem.
What's the driver? They take out. Yeah, I think they just take out what they fancy for a second. They were adamant. They
Copy paste that.
paper ticking isn't in
Change 4 variables at the top. Stack.
Yeah, I didn't do exercise 1 at all in the end. I just went straight to exercise 2 and more stuff, and we managed to convert the document.
Because again, it's this thing of
display in the free map.
You got the output.
Yeah.
Yeah, then have a look.
So
good software engineers, but
yeah, so the document was that list, the checklist of exercise 1, and it loaded.
which lens used to work with people.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're asked to send it.
Structural security, but I'm forced to because there's nothing else to actually.
So yeah, the process for that, I asked some background information first, like
That's the point.
Yeah, exactly.
in context to understand.
You know, yeah, exactly.
Team.
But it was here. Pen testers were here.
I've only got one guy in London.
Oh, yeah.
It's most of it's
To do
They were hacking
scheme.
container. It's quite something. One of the things they do is
So
That was a screen.
they can actually stabilize
Top.
the first time
navigation.
gave an example schema with some nonsense data in, so I had to rephrase the generic schema. To rephrase it.
There's marks. Container ships.
Oh, good.
They know what containers.
I'm all to the
If you go in and hack the temperature thing, you cause volatile products
what
to
you
go into
is
and you can destabilize the ship.
you YAML.
But it's, I was at a conference last week, so I finally.
Have you got a card?
Is this the first?
Being delivered to the UK.
How to get to that.
When you're feeling being ticketed, you have
I sort of, I always forget, how do you get to it?
Yeah.
All you do is click there,
Sorry.
we have to search,
Yeah.
and it's there.
Right.
Python script that could do it.
And I asked, please, can I have a YAML schema for a free plane?
Verify myself.
Stuff with.
But, you know, I was at a conference last week,
Testing and the navigation and
for chief data officers.
so that was fascinating.
It was a fairly impressive crowd, and things like,
Actually totally separate.
plus if you've got samples, because we have
You can
Save it.
BAE system, London Stock Exchange.
the same navigation.
But then I said, please consider generic YAML schema.
Yeah, I know that was quite.
Validate.
This guy
That was a jumbo.
appeared on my LinkedIn.
Schema that I showed you, which seemed to be correct.
Oh, really?
For him when I was at Cambridge.
I think we need to, Romilly, a chance to sum up.
London.
And
One of the reasons I'm not rich is LinkedIn predates my
and surprisingly,
6 months.
Really? Oh, okay.
So we built something.
Excellent session.
That's on the ship, the nav stuff, yeah, with the satellite. Sometimes the password's written on the board. So,
I've closed the breakout.
it's just, they just
If you'd like to come back online and your views on that.
and it is that, so, you know, social engineering, it's a way to.
You can have one voice from each of the groups telling us what it is.
Look under these people's keyboard.
That's without disclosing who you knew. So what he, it was, my boss was working in M&A.
That's one or two of the online.
You probably have it up each other.
Digitized all. Who was the one running each of them?
To install this dependency in order to
Reflect and discuss.
I'm afraid our speaker is not actually.
You found the line.
I could tell you about what the rest of the recording is still on. So if we could ask from each group, so give us one finding. Shall we start over here?
Yeah, okay, so we skipped experiment 1 and went straight to experiment 2. The more, I've never used ChatGPT before. I'm a really rusty Python programmer and programmed properly for a few months. So, and I don't know, I know I've heard of YAML, but haven't really used it in anger, haven't used FreeMap before. So it was really starting from scratch. And the approach that I took was, I assume ChatGPT uses the context of the chat quite a lot. So just started off with background questions to it, like what is FreePlane?
Okay.
What is the FreePlane software? And what is YAML? What's a YAML schema and things like that. And then I asked it to give us a YAML schema. It gave an example schema, had to refine it a bit to tell it I want a generic schema that I can use to validate any mind map in.
Okay.
And it eventually came up with that schema. Then I asked it, can you convert the attached document into the schema that you've just provided? And it did it.
Yeah.
And then I asked it, how can I load this into FreePlane? And it gave me a Python script that would convert the YAML into an MM file, which is what.
Surprisingly straightforward, wasn't it? Just
Yeah.
step after step. And
Yeah.
I mean, Romilly's obviously pre-packaged that for us. Okay. Yeah, we found the same. We fell at the last hurdle because I installed using Homebrew. I installed FreePlane, but it didn't. It didn't find it for some reason in the shell.
Well, we managed to install FreePlane and display the schema, and it did manage to successfully load it in the end. You needed little supporting questions like what file format and things like that.
we in the first exercise like mostly copying and pasting the suggested prompt and loading the support file for extra context, and it worked straight away. And then for the second exercise, we first went step by step, and ChatGPT, the first thing it did was just executing and getting the FreePlane file by itself, rather than giving the Python code for it. And then when asked for it, it also provided the code. We also asked ChatGPT how to install and run Python, because I didn't have it installed, and was very helpful on that too. But we didn't get to install FreePlane to test the YAML file generated. But
So I think so far we've all found that it was surprisingly straightforward to make progress. Is there any sort of contrasting finding from elsewhere in the room? Did anyone hit a roadblock?
I do have some thoughts to offer. We didn't actually do the exercises because we've been working with AI and coding for several years, 2 years, which is about kind of as long as you can have been doing it, in a way. I think that there's something that, since Romilly's not here, I am kind of reacting to something there that I feel is hasn't been quite presented the way I might, which is that he does tend to talk about the tool and not as much about the model. And these two are both important. And he's saying, oh, the tool is really important. The tool is important. And you can master, like any tool, you can develop your mastery of using that tool. But actually the model that you use is also very important. And you know, quite recently we've had upgrades from Gemini to 2.5, from Claude Sonnet from 3.5 to 3.7. And those have been big leaps in the competence of the models to be able to do things. We've also the tooling of Cursor and Klein and Surfboard, or whatever it's called, it's leapfrogging, but you can't learn all of them. So it's kind of like you've got to choose one. So choose a leader, and you know, get to grips with that, because you know, as you learn the tool, you'll get better at using it. So
Could I
things
check?
like,
Because
things
probably
like when you give it a rule, you can give them rules to say, this is the way I'd like you to approach coding. Very useful to do that. You can find now catalogs of rules that people have volunteered to show things that have worked for them. So welcome back, Romilly. So I'm just
yeah. I
I
heard the bit when you said I wasn't there, so don't worry.
okay, I take it all back then.
No, you're absolutely right. And you know, if Imo wants me to talk for a day,
yeah,
I'll cover all those things. And you're right that the emphasis was.
That was excellent.
On your laptop, email.
What's wrong with that?
Yeah, I wanted to show who was speaking. Thank you. If there's anybody online that wants to come in at this point, please feel free. But we've gone over the time, so I think we need to wrap up.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Emo, would you allow me one question to Romilly? Hello, Romilly. It's Mark Woodman here. We haven't seen each other for about 30 years or something. Have you looked at doing some of what you've talked about with Smalltalk? Because although the training stuff wouldn't be there, something like Smalltalk Squeak should be very amenable to.
I'm spending an hour a day learning Faro.
Oh, right. Okay.
And the reason I'm doing that is because Simon Wardley and a colleague of his have introduced me to their glamorous toolkit. And if you haven't heard of that and you're interested in Smalltalk, take a look. It's mind-blowing.
Right. Thank you for that tip. We've been connected on LinkedIn for donkey's years. If you could, we should talk some more about this, because I think it's going to be very useful. Because Smalltalk is much more, in my opinion, much more amenable to this stuff than even Python.
Yes.
But the Python's got the code base.
Yeah, I mean, the trouble is I've got 4 or 5 favorite languages, and Python's big attraction is almost everyone knows about it, and there's the huge code base. If I've got a tough maths problem, I still go back to APL, and now I'm going to be going back to Smalltalk more. And I think you're absolutely right. It's a good fit. Interestingly, the reason that I started on my Smalltalk career was because I wanted to build a tool to do mind mapping back in 1987.
That's a great note on which to end.